Iron chain. Martha Dawkins heard the crunch of gravel underfoot and knew, even before she glanced up, who was standing at the edge of her garden path. Marcus Carter. He looked every inch the spy master he once was. Tall, coat buttoned to the neck, his grey hair now fully silver, but his eyes as sharp as ever. A wave of memories washed over her, nights spent in dimly lit briefing rooms, whispered conversations, the cold shadow of fear that came with every mission. But she'd walked away from all that, or so she thought. "Marcus," she said, her voice betraying none of her unease. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He didn't return the pleasantry, his face carved from stone as he handed her a small, unmarked envelope. "It's urgent," he said simply. She glanced at the envelope, knowing instinctively that whatever was inside would pull her back into a world she'd carefully avoided for years, a world that had cost her nearly everything. "Open it, Martha." With a sigh, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a card with a single line of code, a series of letters and numbers she recognized instantly. Her breath hitched. It was a clearance code she hadn't seen in years, one that signaled a mission so sensitive it bypassed the usual channels. "It's iron chain," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The files are in danger." The name jolted her like a slap. Iron chain. An operation as infamous as it was classified. During the Cold War, it had been designed to unearth double agents within the British government, exposing officials whose loyalties had twisted under Soviet influence. But the mission had a darker side, one that had left scars on those involved, including Martha. And now, after decades, it was resurfacing. "Why me?" she managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside her. "Because you know the bunker. You designed its security protocols, set up the traps, the countermeasures. We need you to secure the files before anyone else does." Marcus paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Veseli is back. He's after the files." A chill crept down her spine. Emil Veseli. The man she'd once called her equal and her nemesis in a single breath. They'd matched wits during the height of the Cold War, a shadow game that had ended with the capture and death of her closest friend. She'd been told Veseli was dead, but apparently MI6 had lied. No surprise there. "Why now?" she asked, her voice hollow. "What's so urgent about these files that you'd risk me after all these years?" Marcus's expression softened ever so slightly. "Because the files don't just implicate Soviet spies. They name high-ranking British officials still in power today. If they leak, it'll topple institutions, Martha. It'll tear us apart." She turned away, the familiar ache of old wounds resurfacing. She'd buried her past for a reason, left the agency, left that life, and yet here it was, resurrected and ugly, thrust back into her hands. "Look, I understand your hesitation," Marcus said quietly, "but we think Iron Chain holds something else, evidence that could explain what happened to your friend, why she was captured, why she died." Martha's hands tightened around the envelope. It was an old ache, dull and quiet, but never forgotten. She'd spent years wrestling with the questions, haunted by the suspicion that her friend's death had been more than a mere casualty of the mission. And now Marcus was offering her answers, or at least the chance to dig deeper. "Don't manipulate me, Marcus," she said, her tone icy. But even as the words left her lips, she knew she'd made her decision. This wasn't about loyalty to MI6 or even patriotism. It was about closure, about finally understanding what had happened all those years ago. Marcus reached into his coat and handed her a small modified device, disguised as an old tape recorder. "This will intercept Veseli's communications. Use it to monitor his movements within the bunker. It'll give you a slight edge, but beyond that, I can't promise much." Martha met his gaze, a faint smirk pulling at her lips. "So, once again, I'm on my own." He nodded, his face shadowed by an unspoken apology. "You know how it is. Officially, this mission doesn't exist. I'll be able to feed you some intel here and there, but MI6 can't afford to make this public. You're operating with minimal support, as always." She slipped the device into her coat pocket and looked out at her quiet garden, the life she'd built here after the chaos. It felt fragile now, like a mirage that could vanish at any moment, but she couldn't resist the pull, the chance to finally put her past to rest, and to face the man who'd once haunted her nightmares. "When do I leave?" she asked, her voice a mixture of resignation and resolve. "Tomorrow. I'll arrange transport to the bunker." With a final nod, Marcus turned and disappeared down the path, leaving Martha standing alone in the fading afternoon light. She closed her eyes, steeling herself for the days to come. She'd made her choice, and as much as she hated to admit it, a small part of her welcomed the return to this world, the sharp focus and adrenaline that came with it. She was back. Whether she'd survive it was another question entirely. The bunker loomed ahead, a grey monolith hidden beneath layers of soil and obscured history. Martha felt her pulse quicken as she stepped into the cold, steel-lined entrance, memories unfurling in the dim light as though they'd been waiting here all along. The stale air, the quiet hum of long-dormant machinery. Everything was as it had been, untouched since she'd last walked these corridors. But there was something else here too, a lingering presence that was both familiar and dangerous. Moving deeper into the bunker, she activated her flashlight and swept it across the entryway. Signs of recent maintenance glinted back at her. Newly replaced hinges on a security door, polished bolts in the wall. MI6 had been here recently, likely preparing for her arrival. But to what end? Her breath clouded in the air as she continued down the corridor, wary of the surveillance cameras she'd helped install all those years ago. A sudden sharp beep cut through the silence, jolting her out of her thoughts. Her old access card, tucked into the waistband of her trousers, buzzed as she scanned it over a familiar panel. The door hissed open and she took a steadying breath before stepping inside. Inside, the security features she'd once designed rose like sentinels of her past self. Each corner held a tripwire, a hidden camera, a trigger to unleash gas or sound alarms if tampered with improperly. Her fingers worked almost instinctively, disengaging the traps with a practiced ease that surprised her. Years had passed, yet the muscle memory was still there, an eerie reminder of her former life. She reached a control room and flicked the main power switch. Fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting harsh shadows that danced across dusty monitors and silent control panels. It was all the same, and yet everything felt altered, layered with a weight she couldn't shake. Martha moved to a far corner, kneeling to pry up a loose tile she'd once used to store sensitive documents. Beneath it, she found the first of the files. Each page felt like a ciphered ghost, revealing snippets of MI6's darkest secrets. Her friend's name surfaced again and again, scattered across the documents as if mocking her. She had always assumed her friend's capture had been an unfortunate casualty, an unforeseeable end to a complex mission. But the truth was far worse. Iron Chain had been devised not only to expose double agents, but to sacrifice them for MI6's greater agenda. Her friend hadn't been caught by chance. She'd been offered up, her life exchanged like a currency in a game of international leverage. A calculated move by an agency willing to burn assets to keep Britain's grip on power. The realization twisted in Martha's stomach, hollow and sickening. She'd been a pawn all along, a means to an end. The betrayal settled over her like a dark fog, creeping into the edges of her vision, sharpening her senses. Her fingers brushed the files, now gritty and hostile beneath her hands, and she felt something akin to rage, a simmering anger at the deception, the manipulation, the audacity of MI6 to treat lives as dispensable. A small distinct sound, footsteps, someone else was in the bunker. She closed her eyes, her mind already calculating the probabilities, preparing herself. It had to be Veseli. She knew it as instinctively as she'd known the layout of this place. He was here, just as Marcus had predicted. Only now it felt like more than coincidence. It felt engineered. Veseli's steps echoed faintly, measured and calm, as if he wanted her to hear him coming. Martha reached into her pocket, pulling out the encrypted device Marcus had given her. She activated it, hoping to intercept any transmissions, but instead she found a message. One line encoded, but unmistakably directed at her. "Hello, Dawkins. Ready to finish what we started?" The message pulsed on the screen, taunting her. Veseli had known she would come. Of course he had. He understood her as well as she understood him. Their histories were intertwined, bound by shared experiences, betrayal, and most recently, the deaths of those caught in the crossfire of their work. "Still hiding behind screens, Veseli," she murmured, knowing full well he couldn't hear her. But his message had rattled her. She pocketed the device, moving quietly into the shadows. Veseli had a way of getting under her skin, and she couldn't afford to lose focus now. Following the corridor to a secondary control room, she came upon more files. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them, each revelation darker than the last. MI6 had identified Soviet sympathizers within the government and had quietly traded them as currency, giving Soviet agents the opportunity to spy on and infiltrate Western institutions under careful watch. The agency's methods weren't simply about protecting Britain. They were about manipulating global power, sustaining control through sacrifice and deception. Her friend's death wasn't a tragic misstep. It was part of a brutal calculus, a price that had to be paid. A noise from behind, a click, barely audible but unmistakable. Martha turned sharply, instinctively moving back as Veseli emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by the dim light. "Digging up old graves, are we?" he asked, his tone mocking. Martha kept her gaze steady. "I suppose you think yourself above this place, above what MI6 and KGB used to play at?" "Don't pretend you didn't know," he said, a small cold smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You knew what this work cost, the debts it collects. I never imagined you'd be the sentimental type." "It's not about sentiment," she replied, the weight of the files in her hand. "It's about truth." "Truth?" Veseli chuckled, shaking his head. "I've long abandoned that particular illusion, but you—" His eyes gleamed with something cruel. "I suppose you're here to play hero, to rewrite the past." Her silence was answer enough, and Veseli seemed to enjoy it. "If it helps, your friend wasn't the only one sacrificed. I have my own debts," he said, taking a step closer. "We're both ghosts of this Cold War charade. But the difference, Martha, is I don't pretend it ever meant something more." "Why are you here, Veseli? What's your end game?" "Simple. I want to bring the whole farce down," he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Britain's intelligence network, the foundations that men like Marcus built. It's all rotten. Exposing these files will be the first strike." She looked at him, 1,000 questions flashing in her mind, but one stood above the rest. Had MI6 brought her here simply as a lure, to draw Veseli out, to let him play his hand, while they watched from the shadows. Veseli took a step back, his voice echoing down the narrow hall. "You were always their most faithful tool, Martha, but you're starting to see it now, aren't you? You were never meant to survive this game." In that moment, everything snapped into sharp focus. She realized her role was far more expendable than she'd believed, her life woven into a tapestry of betrayal she was only beginning to unravel. As she moved to confront Veseli, she heard Marcus's voice crackle through her encrypted device. "Leave the files, Martha! Get out!" But she didn't move. The truth had taken root. She was ready to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. Martha paced through the cold, narrow corridors of the bunker, her footsteps muffled by the silence. Every turn, every darkened corner felt like a calculated risk. She'd spent years studying this labyrinthine layout, but now each wall seemed to breathe with menace. Veseli was somewhere ahead, lurking in the shadows, his presence a coiled spring waiting to snap. She slowed, formulating her next move. Veseli had always favoured psychological warfare, chipping away at his opponent's sense of control. And he knew how to dig beneath her skin, where guilt and betrayal festered. But she was no longer the naive agent he'd encountered years ago. If he was here to unearth her weaknesses, she'd show him just how deep her resolve ran. The silence fractured as she heard a soft, deliberate tap echoing through the hallway behind her. She crouched low, allowing her familiarity with the bunker to guide her. She slipped into a passageway, sliding a metal panel over her hiding spot, her breathing even as she listened. Veseli's footsteps grew louder, each step a measured, intentional sound designed to let her know he was near. "Martha!" he called, his voice laced with mock concern. "Hiding already? I thought you'd be braver than that." She stayed silent, hearing him stop just beyond her position. "You know, the last time we were here," he continued, "I told her she'd die for her loyalty, that it would consume her as it will consume you." He let his words linger, knowing they'd strike a nerve. "But maybe you don't care anymore, now that you know the truth." Martha forced herself to stay calm. His words burrowed into her mind, each one a twisted reminder of her friend's death. But this time Veseli wasn't going to control the narrative. She pulled a thin wire from her pocket, wrapping it around a loosened screw that controlled a small gas valve connected to a storage room further down the hall. It was a rudimentary setup, one she'd devised during her training here. She waited for him to step closer, timing her move. Just as his shadow fell across her hiding spot, she twisted the wire, triggering a hiss of pressurized gas from the storage room. Veseli spun toward the sound, distracted. It was all the opening she needed. She slipped out, ducking into the opposite corridor, where she could circle around him. Her footsteps quickened, her breath steady as she maneuvered through the bunker's winding corridors. She'd positioned herself strategically by the central vault, a narrow, reinforced room designed to store documents in a lockdown. It was a dead end, but she could force him in, limit his movements. The trap was set. "Not bad, Martha," Veseli called, his voice drawing closer. "But I know this place as well as you do." Her fingers curled around the edge of the vault door, ready to close it the second he entered. She braced herself, listening as his steps grew louder, his breathing uneven. He was close now, close enough that she could see his shadow stretch across the floor. Then he was there, facing her, his gaze glinting with dark amusement. "And here we are," he said, stepping into the room, his body language smug as though he'd already won. "Here we are," she replied coolly, slamming the door shut behind him. She twisted the lock, trapping them both in the dimly lit concrete space. Veseli laughed softly. You think I'm cornered? I think you underestimate just how prepared I am, she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. In one swift motion he lunged, but she sidestepped, slamming her elbow into his back, sending him reeling against the wall. He recovered quickly, countering with a calculated strike, his moves still swift and precise. They grappled in close quarters, each countering the other's moves, locked in a battle that was as much about endurance as it was about skill. Martha, he sneered, his voice a laboured whisper, you're still MI6 puppet. You're here because they wanted you to die for them. She held his gaze, her anger surging. And you're here because they needed a traitor to finish the job. She drove her knee into his side, forcing him to drop the device he'd been clutching. She kicked it out of his reach. Veseli stumbled, visibly shaken, but his expression darkened. You've barely scratched the surface, Dawkins, he sneered. You think you're different? They'll discard you the second this mission is over. Then let them try, she replied, grabbing his wrist and twisting him into a hold he couldn't break. She rested him down, her grip unyielding, and secured him against the wall, catching his encrypted device. With a quick swipe of her finger, she unlocked the device. It was filled with data, names, dates, locations, all meticulously catalogued, evidence of those who had sacrificed their loyalty for power. These files were damning, enough to topple high-ranking officials who had shaped Britain's intelligence web. She stood over him, victorious but not triumphant. Veseli's expression was one of grudging respect, his breath laboured as he glared at her. You've won the battle, he muttered, but you'll lose the war. You're as complicit as I am. In that moment she knew he was right. MI6 had manipulated her, exploited her, used her to bring down Veseli, and she'd played her part perfectly. Her loyalty had come at a price she'd paid with pieces of her soul. Ignoring his final taunts, she activated her device and sent Marcus a message, confirming the files were secure. His reply came quickly, but his words were cold, clinical. Well done, Martha. Leave the files. We'll handle the rest. She stared at the message, a bitter realization settling in her chest. Marcus's indifference to her sacrifices cut deeper than any of Veseli's taunts. She had been nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. Veseli's parting words echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain. But she wasn't about to walk away empty-handed. Instead of following orders, she accessed the files, copying select portions of the iron chain data, enough to expose the worst offenders, while protecting those who'd been coerced or manipulated. With a final glance at Veseli, she turned and walked out of the bunker. Marcus's next message appeared on her screen, blunt and impersonal. You were always meant to survive. She discarded the device, leaving it to blink in the cold, dark corridor. She had been loyal, had sacrificed without question, but now she was done. Her allegiance to MI6 was over. As she stepped into the dawn light outside the bunker, she felt something she hadn't in years. Freedom. It wasn't clean, it wasn't satisfying, but it was hers. She was no longer a pawn in MI6's shadowed game. The secrets she now held were powerful, a quiet weapon against the agency that had betrayed her. With a resolve as unbreakable as the walls she'd left behind, Martha walked away, a former agent who had chosen her own path, determined to expose truth over loyalty.